Hi everyone, how are you all doing tonight? Welcome to our St. Patrick's Day chocolate tasting and whiskey and or bourbon pairing, depending on what you chose to drink tonight. We have a few specialists on the call tonight that can kind of walk you through the chocolate and the whiskey or bourbon. Let us know in the chat area what you're pairing it with tonight so we can try to customize it to your specific drinks and make it a more enjoyable tasting experience. So whether you're pairing it with whiskey or bourbon, if you took the suggestions for an email, go ahead and use the chat box and let us know what you're trying. My name is Lauren. I'll be your host for tonight, and we have Mark Mackey and John Donahue on the call as well, and they will be your chief chocolatier and your spirits expert. So we will give everyone just one more minute to join. You may have noticed you all have video capabilities. So this is a meeting format. Since we're a bit of a smaller group, we can get a little more personal. So if you don't mind, we would love to have your videos on. Feel free to also unmute if you have a question or use the chat box. We do want to try to keep a majority of the general questions to the very end so that we keep this at about an hour experience. And then if there's any questions, we can take about 10 or 15 minutes after the tasting and answer any questions you may have for Mark or John. So let's just give everyone a few more minutes and then we can hop right into the pairings. So while we wait, I'll introduce your two experts. We have Mark Mackey, who, if you've done these tastings before, you already know him. He is our chief chocolatier and our senior R&D scientist here at Ethel Chocolates. That means he helps to create new pieces for our product line, some of which you'll actually be trying tonight. We also have John Donahue on the call. He was in the spirits and wine industry for 12 years until coming to Mars Ridley, which we are so happy to have him. He is also an accredited wine specialist, so he can, if you're pairing it with wine, maybe you weren't a fan of the whiskey or the bourbon, he can also help you with any of those questions. And I will go ahead and hand it over to Mark, and he will talk to you about the history of Ethel Chocolates and get into your tasting.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's having a wonderful St. Patrick's Day. Really excited to be here with all of you today. We'll be tasting some delicious chocolates, and also pairing with some delicious Irish whiskeys, bourbon, maybe some wine as well, if you're not a fan of those. All perfectly acceptable and great pairings with chocolate. But first, I want to talk just a little bit about Ethel and introduce our chocolate brand. So we were founded back in 1981 by Forrest Mars Sr. And that was after he had retired from the Mars Candy Company that he helped to build with his father. So as many folks do when they retire, you know, they kind of get that itch or that bug that they want to start something new and something fresh. Well, Forrest decided he wanted to move to Las Vegas, not just because of the warmer climate, but because he wanted to start a premium boxed chocolate company. You know, he felt that you weren't really in the chocolate business unless you had a premium boxed chocolate, something that you could gift and share with your friends and family. And so he moved to the Las Vegas area to do just that. And he started Ethel Chocolates really as an homage to his mother, Ethel, and in fact used her original recipes from her home kitchen in Tacoma, Washington. He used those recipes to actually, they were the foundation, the building blocks for his core product portfolio when he launched. And in fact, some of those pieces are in our tasting tonight, some of those original signature recipes from Ethel's kitchen. All right. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be tasting some delicious chocolate tonight, but we're also going to be using all of our senses to really evaluate each piece of chocolate. Obviously, taste is very important, but we also want to include our other senses, our sense of touch. We want to pick up the piece, feel for any bumps. Is it smooth? Is it kind of bumpy? Is it soft? Is it rough? Aroma, or our sense of smell. A lot of what we taste is actually helped it's helped by our nose and our sense of smell and our olfactory senses. And so it's very important that we really get a nice aroma or a feel for the aroma of the piece. And that's going to help our sense of taste and actually allow us to pick up on a lot more of those nuances and flavors. Believe it or not as well, we're also going to be listening to our chocolate using our sense of hearing when we bite into the piece. A sign or a hallmark of very well-tempered chocolate is actually a little bit of a snap, an audible snap that you can hear when you bite into the piece. So be on the lookout for that. We mentioned taste. Want to be thinking about all those aromas, those textures that are melting. How are those flavors coming out? Are they coming out, up front? Are they a little more muted and then coming out a little later in the experience when you're chewing them? And also when we're pairing with the whiskey or the bourbon, we want to think about how those flavors are evolving and changing in our mouths. What are the complementary flavors? What are the contrasting flavors? And how are they changing and evolving? Those are all really, really important things to consider while we're tasting, as well as the finish, or what we call the linger. So chocolate, after you have kind of chewed the piece, swallowed, you're still going to have a little bit of that residual flavor that's going to remain on your tongue. And so when you're left with that finish, think about how long that's lasting between each of the pieces. As we go through, I think you'll find the milk chocolate will be fairly short to more medium in linger, and the dark chocolate pieces are going to be much longer, and those will stay with you for some time after you finish the piece. So it's kind of interesting to compare that as we go through each of the pieces tonight. All right.
Mark, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that as well.
Sure.
Just when you do whiskey as well, or wine, when you're doing the tastings and the pairings, you really want to do the same thing: touch, smell, taste, finish. A lot of people, when I do events like this, I equate it to a Coca-Cola society. We're usually not even paying attention to the finish before we're taking our next sip of wine or whiskey or whatever. So you really want to settle into the chocolate and settle into the whiskey, because just like your wheel there next to your tasting mat for chocolate, a lot of the similarities are on a whiskey wheel as well. So you're going to find even some lemon and almond and walnut and caramel. So just almost act like you're settling into that nice, warm, comfy chair and taste. Want to say happy Patty's Day, St. Patty's Day to everybody as well. What better way to celebrate than some Irish whiskey, some bourbon, and some good company. So I do see there's some people all in. They've got all five they're tasting. So we'll go over some of it as we go with Mark. But some people are doing some different things too, which is all fine, because that's a neat thing about the whiskey pairings and wine pairings and even beer and coffee. It's meant to elevate your tasting. So in logical math, it's 2 + 2 = 4. This, we really want 2 + 2 to = 5 or 6. So these things are going to complement and play off of one another. So just really leave it on your tongue. I would encourage everybody to drink it room temperature, to have a little glass of water, just room temperature next to it. The way you're taught to taste whiskey, when you go and meet with a master distiller or something, they will have a little dropper and they'll just put a little drop of water in it, and it'll just explode the aromas especially. And then some of these whiskeys tonight are 94 and 100 proof. So don't feel like you need to drink it at total proof. You can water it down to 70%, 60%. Some of these master distillers will do the same thing.
Mute.
So
Okay, we want to. Oh no, we want.
Can
you hear?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. So go ahead, Mark, and take back over.
We're muted.
Sure. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I actually just did that. I have a little bit of, I've got the Bushmills Black Bush here. I poured a little bit of that into my first glass, and then I've also got some of the Jamison Stout Edition here that I've poured into my second glass, and I added just a little dropper full, as you mentioned, recommended, just a little bit of that water. And I can really tell like the aromas that are coming out much more fragrant and powerful than they were when I first poured them. So that's a great tip that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life when I'm trying whiskeys and I guess whiskeys in general, Irish, Scotch, bourbon, etc.
It works for all of them.
Excellent. So if you haven't poured yourself a little sample of your whiskey, your bourbon, your wine, go ahead and do so. And open up your box of chocolates if you haven't already. We've got 6 delicious chocolates that we'll be trying tonight. And you should have also a tasting little placemat there that you can capture some notes as we go through for any of the sensory categories that you'd like. Completely optional, but I like to kind of capture notes as I go through on the pairing itself, maybe on some of the flavors, things that were unexpected, just to kind of note those for the future. But take a look down at the lower left-hand side and you'll see we have a flavor and aroma wheel there. So that's going to have a lot of the different specific nuances and notes that we'll be looking for in our chocolate. And you'll see we've broken that out into different categories and then the specific notes or detailed specific nuances in each of those categories as well. And especially, applicable to the tasting tonight with Irish whiskey, with bourbon, we're going to be looking at that earthy category a little bit more than we might normally with chocolate. You might think like, oh, wow, I wouldn't want my chocolate to taste like, grass or mushroom or tobacco. And that's usually true as a primary flavor. But as I mentioned to folks, a lot of times we have these primary or kind of top notes, and then we have these more supporting or background flavors and nuances. And the earthy notes a lot of times can be in the background, really elevating and enhancing the chocolate and also the bourbon as well. And so be on the lookout for those as we go through tonight. What are the primary flavors, but then also what are those background notes? And as you taste, what I like to do sometimes as well is, kind of breathe in with your mouth, kind of breathe in a little bit as you're tasting, and that's going to help to aerate everything in your mouth a little bit more and help to bring out more of those aromas and flavors in the piece. But enough talking, done enough of that already. Why don't we start with our first piece of chocolate here, and that is our milk chocolate macadamia salute right here. So pick this piece up. The first thing you'll notice, you'll look and notice how bumpy that is from those macadamia nuts that are sitting just below the chocolate. We've sealed those macadamias in what we call an enrobe of milk chocolate. Bring that up to your nose. And depending on the temperature in the room, if it's a little bit colder, what I like to do is kind of rub the bottom or the side a little bit. And that's going to start to soften the chocolate. If it's a little colder, it'll start to soften that and bring out more of those aromatics. You'll be getting some milk chocolate notes, what we call roasted cocoa, caramelized milk, maybe a little bit of some butteriness, some nuttiness coming through from the macadamia nuts. Now take a bite. Oh. You'll see here just that thin layer of chocolate around the macadamia nut. When you bite into this piece, the first thing you'll taste, you'll get that nuttiness from the macadamia, but you'll notice it's very buttery. It's very delicate in terms of what you would consider a nut or a nut flavor. So macadamia nuts they're the most expensive nut in the world. Their average is about $25 a pound or so. But these come to us from Hawaii. And they have this beautiful, delicate, kind of buttery, light, nutty flavor that works really, really nicely with our milk chocolate. We have a little bit of caramel that's coming through as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next piece. A little bit of vanilla. And then as the chocolate melts away, you'll taste a little bit more of that macadamia kind of coming through. Now, if you've got your glass of whiskey or bourbon or wine, go ahead and give that a little swirl. Get a sense for the aroma of that. I've got the Bushmills Black Bush here. It's got a little bit of like, excuse me, a little bit of like an apple aroma, a little citrus. So I'm sipping a little bit and then I'm kind of slurping it just lightly in my mouth. And that's kind of bringing out a lot of the aromatics. It's bringing air across my tongue and kind of bubbling that to bring out more of those aromatic compounds. And then go back and try a taste or a bite of your chocolate. You'll notice the chocolate kind of balances and tempers the little bit of the bite from the whiskey or the bourbon. Adds a really nice creaminess that enhances the overall experience.
Yeah, I'm drinking the Jamison Black Barrel, and I kind of noticed the same thing. A lot of the same notes, and with the lightness of the Irish whiskey versus a bourbon, or I saw somebody was drinking some rye as well. This is really making it creamier, bringing out the finish. So the finish is really getting longer. So this is a good part showing that 2 + 2 = more than 4, because it's really getting in there. With the macadamia nut being so light, the Irish use, when they make their whiskeys, used barrels. So they use a lot of bourbon barrels. They use sherry casks for a lot of fortified wines. And by law, bourbon has to use new charred oak barrels. So you'll see usually the heartier nuts will pair a little bit better with the bourbon. Something lighter like the macadamia nut goes really well with the Jamison.
Excellent. All right, so go ahead and continue to enjoy that piece. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where chocolate comes from, and then we'll jump back and try our next piece, all right? So chocolate, actually all real chocolate, comes from a cocoa pod, and that grows on a cocoa tree, but that's only typically around 20 degrees north and south of the equator where those cocoa trees actually thrive. They need a very tropical and actually quite humid hot environment in which to grow well. And actually they do their best when they're growing kind of in the canopy of the rainforest. And I actually have a real cocoa pod here. And this pod is actually from Ecuador. And it's of they call it it's the Nacional variety here that's grown in Ecuador. And this pod actually grows on the trunk of the tree. So if you think about this as actually being the fruit of the cocoa tree, it'll grow on the branches a little bit, but then also a lot of them will grow on the trunk, which is kind of unique when you think about how fruit normally grows. So when these are growing, the farmer, as these ripen, they're going to kind of harvest these from the cocoa tree. They're going to pull them down. They're going to kind of pile them up into a big pile. And then they're going to cut inside of each pod, because what we want to make chocolate is actually from the cocoa bean that is inside of this pod. And so I'm going to do that right now. Cut into this. And I'm going to show you the inside. It looks a little gross, but those are cocoa beans. And you'll notice they don't look brown, right? Like you would think for making chocolate. And that's because they're actually covered in this, pull one out here, this white pulp. So this is actually quite sweet. It's a little acidic as well. So it tastes kind of like a lychee or a pineapple with a little apple, you know, or like a watermelon kind of flavor, but it's pretty sweet. and doesn't taste anything like chocolate. Doesn't smell anything like chocolate. It smells very, very tropical. But this pulp actually serves a very, very important purpose in chocolate making, and that is fermentation. So when the farmers cut open these pods, they're going to scoop out all of these beans inside of the pod. They're going to scoop them out and kind of pile them up. And the sugars in the pulp, those are going to start to break down into acetic and lactic acid. And what's going to start to happen is something called fermentation. So just like we ferment sugars into alcohol and develop a lot of delicious flavors, like in our bourbon and Irish whiskey, we're going to do the same thing with cocoa beans. But with cocoa beans, we're developing these very complex, fruity, floral nuances that are going to make their way and transform into delicious chocolate flavors in our finished chocolate. So that fermentation process will take about 5 to 7 days. And afterwards, you'll notice that the beans will turn from that white color to kind of a brown color, light brown, as they start to oxidize. Some of that moisture dries up. Now we're going to just dry them out completely. After the fermentation is complete, we're done. We can't get any more additional benefit from fermenting. So we're going to dry those beans out in a very thin layer. That'll take a few more days. And, because it's very sunny, that'll just really happen quite nicely. We have them very thin there so that we get a lot of air circulation to kind of cool those beans down and also dry them out. And I think what we'll do is leave our beans there. We'll take a little bit of a break and we'll jump back a little later and actually pick up where we left off. So let's jump over to our next piece of chocolate, which is our pecan caramel Rapture. So go ahead and pick this piece up. This is another bumpy piece. It actually gets its shape from the pecans. And the way that we make this piece, we actually start by taking our sugar and butter and we make this delicious caramel. And we're going to heat those ingredients up, develop this delicious caramel, and we're going to pour that over our bed of pecans. And as the caramel kind of flows through the pecan bed, it's going to grab onto those pecans and start to set up and actually form a unique cluster shape. And so you'll look, if you've got your friend or family member next to you, you can kind of compare the Raptures and they're going to look a little bit different. That's because they are all a little unique depending on kind of how that caramel set up on the pecans. So once that cluster has been formed, we're going to place it onto our enrobing line. And then it's going to go through and get just a beautiful waterfall coating of our creamy milk chocolate. We have a little fan in there. It's going to blow off the excess and it'll transfer onto our enrobing belt where it will cool and be ready to enjoy. So if you haven't already, pick up your Rapture. Bring that up to your nose, kind of get a nice feel for the aroma. A little bit of more of that milk chocolate, caramelized milk note coming through. A little pecan as well. Some vanilla. If you flip it over too, you might smell a little bit more intense. I get like a little bit of woodiness, maybe in that like leather category. A lot of times you can pick up some wood notes, from the roasting process that the pecans actually go through, can kind of develop some of those notes. All right, let's take a bite.
That's what's great about you driving us through this. I didn't get leather until you pointed it out. There it was. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those things, I find even depending on when I'm tasting or what I'm tasting, sometimes you can't put your finger on exactly what you're experiencing until, sometimes you get a little help or, a lot of times I'll look down at that flavor wheel and if something I'm not able to really pick up on it, if I look at that, I can usually like, oh yeah, that's what I'm sensing. So when you bite into this one, you might even have picked up a little bit of that crunchiness from the roasted pecans. You have that buttery vanilla caramel. roasted cocoa, maybe a little bit of toasty notes coming through as well. Something that we call cooked milk or scalded milk, as we're heating that butter and that cream up and caramelizing that sugar. We're also developing some beautiful brown notes or some some notes that are similar to caramel, but they're actually formed by something called the Maillard reaction. Similar to caramel, whereas caramel is really around caramelizing sugars and developing those types of flavors there. The Maillard reaction is really specific to amino acids or protein. So it's something that we get when we brown protein, things like, you know, protein in cream or in butter. It's a very different browning reaction that also is contributing a lot of delicious flavors to this piece as well.
Yeah, the tasting notes here, this is a perfect piece to go with whiskey. Like you were mentioning, the woody notes are there. It made it creamier. I'm even getting a little coffee when I'm drinking the Jamison Black Barrel. So this is with the pecans and the creaminess of the caramel. This is just the perfect one to sit down with and have your whiskey and have at it. So this one I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, I have the Black Bush as well, and I just had a sip of that, and I'm noticing the caramel notes before I tried the whiskey. I mean, the caramel notes were there; they were pretty prominent. And I had a little sip of the whiskey. I got a little bit of that warmth, a little bit of the bite, but then the caramel notes are coming out even stronger now than they were previously, which is really a really fun kind of experience as you're trying both together.
Yeah, and when it's really room temperature and you kind of just take enough whiskey to kind of coat on top of the chocolate and the pecans and the caramel that is there, that's when the addition starts happening. It opens your eyes to a whole lot more.
You'll notice too, you'll get, like, at least I do, and I'm getting a lot of caramel too, kind of coming from the aroma of the whiskey. And you'll notice, if you look at a lot of the pieces we're trying tonight, there's a lot of caramel, a lot of caramelized flavors or deeper, you know, brown flavors, things like that, that can be complemented by that. And I'm really, picking up on that as I try these pieces. All right, so go ahead and capture any notes that you'd like on that one. Or if you'd like to, if you have any questions about anything we've discussed so far, go ahead and put that in the chat and we'll address that when we can. And now we will jump over to another caramel-like piece. And this is our almond butter crisp. So this is actually a very special piece. This is one of our original or classic 16 recipes from Ethel's kitchen. And you'll notice as you kind of unwrap this piece, this really beautiful copper colored foil. You might ask why we have the foil, why we wrap this piece in foil. And when you unwrap it, you'll notice one of the reasons why, and that's because the outside of this piece is coated in these very small little dices. So these are actually raw or blanched almond dices, and they're not roasted. So they're more, they actually blanch them. So they're almost like boiled or blanched. So it's a very different flavor than like a roasted almond flavor that we actually would have inside of this piece. So these raw almond dices, they're very susceptible to oxidation. And so we wrap them in that foil to really help trap and prevent them from picking up that or going stale and picking up on that oxygen. So if you pick this piece up, pick it up, and you can smell really those beautiful lighter almond notes. And they are a little different, actually quite a bit different than the roasted almond aroma. This is a little lighter, a little more delicate. You actually get some butteriness coming through, and that's not actually from the toffee inside, but it's actually coming from the almond. So with this piece, we're going to start by making what would look like a caramel up front at the very beginning. So we're going to take butter and sugar. We're going to heat those up to about 230 degrees. That's when we get our delicious caramel. But in this case, we're going to drive it even hotter. We're going to take it up to 300 degrees. And that's what's going to give us and form this toffee texture that we'll be tasting in a moment. And while we're heating up those ingredients, we're going to add our diced almonds. So we actually have two different types of almonds in this piece. We have a butter roasted almond that gets added in with the caramel and the toffee. That's going to get butter roasted, heated up to 300 degrees. And then we're going to cool everything down on our cooling tables. And that's going to form that perfect texture in the toffee here. We're going to hand cut those into squares. And then we're going to coat them in just a very thin layer of our creamy milk chocolate. And that's because we want to give these raw almonds on the outside something to stick to. So when we taste this piece, we'll notice, the milk chocolate is really not the star. It's more in a supporting role, whereas the toffee and the almonds, those are really the key players here. So go ahead and take a bite. Listen for the snap. See those butter roasted almonds? See the difference in the color from the outside almonds to the inside? Getting a lot of buttery notes, caramelized sugar notes, but now I'm even getting a little bit of burnt sugar, or a little bit like a hint of some burnt kind of coming through. And it's not overpowering, but it's definitely a little bit more complex and sophisticated than the caramel in the Rapture. Get those nice roasted almond notes, some toffee, more complex caramelized sugar, as I mentioned. Not a whole lot of chocolate, as I said. It's really just a nice thin layer on there just to give those almonds something to stick to. Now go ahead and pick up one of your whiskeys or bourbon. Give that a swirl and try that one. I'm trying, this is the Jamison Stout Edition. Switch it up a little bit with this piece. I would love to hear what you guys are tasting. What are you experiencing with these pairings?
Yeah, I see it's all over the board. I'm watching a little bit of the chat, and there was a 24-year-old Scotch I think somebody was doing, an IPA, some red wine. So we've got some people that are adventurous, and then some people that are going with what was recommended. The good thing about these whiskeys that were selected tonight, the two Irish whiskeys they've been around for 400 years, and the other one, I think 300 and something. So about 40 or 50 years ago, the Irish distilleries almost went totally bankrupt. It went down to, I think, 4 distilleries, and they combined as a co-op to survive. They just had political strife and everything, world wars, and they made it out. So Bushmills has been around. It is the oldest continuously operated distillery in the world. So there's a lot of history. So I'm glad we didn't lose those guys. But between the Knob Creek and the Elijah Craig too, these are all, none of them are craft distilleries where they are around for a number of years. When I've met with distillers and blenders and brand ambassadors, they can tell you exactly where the barrels are being aged that are going to be for their single barrels and everything. They've been doing it long enough that they know exactly where the good stuff is coming from. And that's basically a lot of the distilleries. They go and use the same recipe, mash bill, and they put it in rick houses. And just a side note, there's more bourbon barrels in Kentucky being aged than there are people that live there. So there's a lot of bourbon being rested there. And the difference is in Kentucky or bourbon, It doesn't have to be just made in Kentucky. They lay it down. The places like Scotch and Ireland and Japan, they put them on pallets and stand them up. So there's a little more airflow and everything. So a little bit of nuances between the different whiskeys. But I tell you what, this pairing for me paired a little better. I was drinking Knob Creek, and I found for me between the tasting. So if you're doing Knob or you're doing Elijah Craig, the bourbons really reacted with all the pieces for me about the same. And then the Irish, the Bushmills and the Black Bush, Jamison, Black Barrel kind of did the same notes. Now the cask edition Jamison with the stout, that is aged in used Irish craft whiskey stout barrels. So that gives a little bit of more coffee flavors and creaminess to it. So that one kind of stood a little bit on its own as I tasted through the chocolate. So a little bit of differentiation between them all.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really, before I wasn't really a big, Irish whiskey bourbon drinker, but I'm really getting, I think, because the pairing, it's kind of tempering that bite a little bit more. I'm really enjoying the different pairings and, kind of that different experience that we're getting with the chocolates and the different spirits tonight. So, all right.
Yeah,
well, I think, go ahead.
Well, like we said earlier, was if people are still finding the alcohol a little warm because the Knob Creek's 100 proof, the Elijah Craig is 94. You can pour, I know I'm using a little, I don't have an eyedropper, but I'm using a straw. So I put a couple of drops in there, but I've drank a lot of whiskey over the years in the industry. So you can get it down to where you're comfortable drinking it. If you got to pour, half water, that's fine. You're still going to get those nuances and everything from the barrels there. They'll be a little less pronounced, but you definitely don't want the alcohol to overpower the chocolate and the tasting tonight. So, drink it how you're comfortable drinking. That's how everything should be enjoyed the way you like it. And, have fun.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. I think it's time for us to cross over into the dark side of chocolate. This is one of my favorite pieces. A little bit different than the last two. This is our dark chocolate sea salt caramel. You'll notice when you pick up this piece, apart from it being a darker color than the last two, you'll notice a little bit of that sea salt on top. It's going to add a little bit of a sharp kind of texture there and feel to it. Obviously, the piece is in a square shape. That's from the hand-cut caramel that we make on our cooling tables in the factory. So very similar to how we start with the caramel for the Pecan caramel Rapture. We're going to take the butter, the cream, the sugar. We're going to heat all those ingredients up to 230 degrees. We're going to get that beautiful caramelization happening again. Maillard reaction contributing some wonderful brown notes, getting all of that, those wonderful flavors. Then we're going to cool everything down to about body temperature. And that's when we're going to add our natural vanilla extract. And we use a 10-fold vanilla extract that actually has 10 times the amount of natural vanilla solids than a standard vanilla extract that you might find, at Whole Foods or a supermarket. But this actually is very, very concentrated. So it's almost like a if you've ever had like a really, really good balsamic vinegar, how it's that really thick, kind of viscous viscosity. That is what this vanilla extract is. It's very dark in color, and it's going to add these wonderful, complex vanilla notes into our caramel. And the reason why we add them actually at body temperature, 100 degrees or so, is because it's very volatile. All of those compounds can actually be destroyed by elevated temperatures. So we want to add those in when they're about as cool as possible or as cold as possible in the process. So once we add the vanilla, we're going to cool that caramel down completely on our cooling tables. We'll hand slice each into a square. And then we're going to put it on that enrobing line that I mentioned earlier. It's going to get a waterfall kind of enrobe or drench in our delicious bittersweet dark chocolate. And then each square is going to get a hand sprinkle of that delicious sea salt. And this is not just an ordinary sea salt. This is actually a French gray sea salt. So we get it from Brittany, France. And it actually, in the bay there in Brittany, there is a lot of clay kind of in the bay. And so when the salt crystallizes, it picks up a little bit of that clay. And so you get this very different kind of minerality or mineral note in the salt that breaks up just that, regular salinity or salt flavor that you might taste with just like a normal table salt. But this kind of breaks that up a little bit. It's not quite as salty, and it really enhances the flavor of the chocolate and also of the caramel that is in the center of the piece. So enough talking. Let's go ahead and pick up this piece here. Go up the bottom a little bit, get some of the chocolate to soften. And this one you're going to notice very, very different again than the milk chocolate pieces. This is a dark chocolate, so a lot more roasted cocoa, a kind of a deeper, darker, richer chocolate aroma. You might even get a little bit of coffee or espresso coming through there as well. So with this piece, what I'd like to recommend is actually, we're going to try it upside down. So what this will do is let the salt kind of dissolve on your tongue a little bit. And then that's going to really form the foundation in our mouth in terms of flavor. And then the chocolate will melt and the caramel will melt and everything is going to get enhanced by that salt. So if you'd like, we can take a bite of half and you can try flipping it and trying it the other way for a little bit of a different experience. But if I could recommend that everybody try it face down to start, or top down to start. Just kind of letting the piece sit on my tongue. You notice it be a little bit sharp from that salt, but give it a second. It'll start to dissolve. You'll get that salinity. And now those deeper, darker roasted cocoa notes are coming through. That coffee maybe you might be picking up on, espresso. And then slowly but surely, the chocolate will kind of fade away a little bit. And now we have this beautiful buttery vanilla caramel coming through, kind of taking some of the bitterness away, adding some caramelized milk notes, caramelized sugar notes, vanilla. But what you're noticing is it's now a really nice rounded experience. You get a little bit of the dark chocolate kind of fading away, but it's still there. And it's balanced really nicely with that buttery vanilla caramel. Take a sip of Irish whiskey here.
Tell you what, that sea salt little education was pretty interesting. I've kind of grown to love salt and sea salt, and being from Louisiana, we put Tony Chachere's on everything, but I've gone back to the basics with just sea salt and black pepper and a lot of things. And this sea salt, it tastes different than others. It had that little bit of salinity, that little bit of minerality, and all that, almost like French wine. So it's got a lot to do with that clay that goes into it as well. So I really, really, really love the sea salt. I probably wouldn't have liked it in my younger years, but I tell you what, this piece, especially for me, when I tasted the whiskey, the Stout Edition Jamison that we're tasting with the dark chocolate, it just kind of shone through out of the other five as well. But the caramel notes with any of the whiskeys, you'll definitely be happy with any of the pairings. So
excellent. All right, again, would love to hear your comments, questions, any feedback you have on your pairing there in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as we go through. But as we do that, so go ahead and take another bite of your chocolate, maybe another sip of your whiskey or your bourbon. And I'm going to go back and kind of wrap up our chocolate making process through last few process steps here. So I think you'll remember we last left our beans. They were kind of hanging out a little bit, getting a suntan there in the sun. This is actually when we would be purchasing them and bringing them into our roasting facility to roast into finished chocolate. But before we do that, it's very important that we inspect the beans, because we want to make sure that we have that very nice, even fermentation throughout the entire bean. That fermentation is giving us so much of the flavor that we're seeing and tasting in our finished chocolate. And we're actually going to inspect those beans by slicing them in half. You'll see here we have a box that actually fits one bean per cavity there. We're going to slice the beans in half, and we're going to look at the inside. And you'll see the beans on the left, see how they're very even in terms of coloration throughout the top to the bottom, or the center to the outside. That bean is properly fermented. It's very evenly colored, whereas the beans on the right are actually under fermented. You can see that very distinct separation there between the outside of the bean and the inside of the bean. So those would actually be rejected, and we would not bring those in to make our delicious Ethel chocolate. We would let somebody else, another chocolate company down the street, maybe purchase those beans, but we would reject them and test a new lot to make sure that it met our strict quality standards. All right, so the beans that do pass the test, now we're going to bring them in, we're going to roast them. And that's going to take all of those delicious, really nuances and characteristics that we developed in fermentation, and it's going to transform those into those beautiful chocolatey notes that you taste, and all those characteristics that are really paramount in premium chocolate. And we're going to roast them similar to how we roast coffee beans. We're going to roast them depending on the recipe. We'll roast them to potentially a lighter roast, maybe a medium roast, or a dark roast, all kind of depending on the specific bean type and the finished chocolate that we're planning to make. Every bean is a little bit different, just like grapes, just like any premium ingredient. Grapes that are grown in California are going to be a little different than grapes grown in France or in Italy. And each bean in this case is going to require a little bit of a different roasting profile or roasting temperature, roasting time. And it's going to develop or require a different profile to really bring out the best quality that can be found in those specific beans. So it's a little bit of an art, kind of paying attention to the time and the temperature of the roast. And here I actually have some roasted beans. You can see those beautiful chocolatey colored beans. Can get the aroma. It has all of those really wonderful dark chocolate characteristics. I'm going to hold up a bean here to show you. So you'll notice if I flip this bean around, see how it's cracked there? So because there's still a little bit of moisture left in the bean, when I roast those beans, that moisture is going to turn to steam and come out of the bean. And it's actually going to crack that skin, which is really important because we don't want the skin in our finished chocolate. So I'm just going to pull that off here. You can see how easily that skin comes off. Put that here. And what we're left with is what's called the cocoa nib. This is essentially just the cocoa bean that's been shelled. And this is really what is the building block for finished chocolate. I'm going to squeeze it in my hand. You'll see here, it just crumbles very, very easily. I just took 2 fingers and just squeezed those together, and you can see how it crumbled in my hand. And now these are what we call cocoa nibs or crushed cocoa nibs. And these nibs are about 50% fat or 50% cocoa butter. That's the fat that is found in cocoa. And so when we take these nibs and we grind them, we're going to release all of that cocoa butter, and it's going to start to turn into what looks like finished chocolate. And so as that liquefies, we're going to grind those ingredients down, create our base chocolate. We'll add in some sugar, some milk, maybe some vanilla, depending on the recipe. And we're going to grind and refine all those ingredients down until it's a silky smooth texture on our tongue. And that'll take several hours. And we're going to kind of mix those ingredients together, grind everything down, and form that final delicious chocolate that we, depending on the recipe, milk, dark, or even white chocolate. White chocolate actually too, for those of you that are curious, To get that, what we'll do is we'll take these nibs here and we're actually going to compress them and kind of partially grind them. And what that'll do is allow them to kind of stick together. Some of that cocoa butter is going to come out and we'll form what we call a cocoa cake. And then we're going to take a lot of pressure and we can actually squeeze that cake, which will squeeze out the cocoa butter and the cocoa solids, which are the cocoa powder. So we have cocoa butter and cocoa powder that's basically found in here when you apply a lot of pressure. And to make white chocolate, we just take the cocoa butter and we mix that with a little bit of sugar, some vanilla, maybe some milk. And that's why white chocolate has that kind of yellowish, whitish appearance. And it's typically a little bit sweeter because it doesn't have any of those cocoa solids in it. But with darkened milk chocolate, we still have to do one final step before we can enjoy it. And that's something called tempering. So because chocolate is such a unique ingredient, we need to treat it very, very carefully and pay strict attention to how we heat it and cool it so that when it sets up, it has all of these wonderful characteristics like gloss and shine. It has that snap that you notice when you bit into your chocolates tonight. It doesn't have a hazy appearance or a mottled appearance. All of these things are critical to well-tempered chocolate. And the way that we do that is we heat it up to about 110 degrees. We cool it down to about 80 to 82 degrees. And then we're going to heat it back up until we reach about 86 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the recipe. And that's going to develop just this really stable crystalline structure in the chocolate that's going to give us all of those characteristics that we're looking for. All right, once we've tempered it, really now it's ready to use for any of our chocolate recipes. We can enrobe, we can mold, we can pan with it. It's ready for us to use in our delicious chocolates. All right, but let's jump back and try our next piece here. This is our dark chocolate truffle. So this is one of our newer pieces. We launched this in September of last year. You'll notice this has a beautiful purple color, this nice glossy purple. It almost looks like a piece of art. And we get that on our truffle with an airbrush. We'll actually take our airbrush and spray the molds that we make the truffles in. And we spray them with colored cocoa butter. So we take that same cocoa butter and we add some natural color to it. We put it into an airbrush and we'll actually spray the molds. And so those molds will take that sprayed colored cocoa butter and when we pour chocolate into it, the chocolate will actually pull that colored cocoa butter right off the mold onto the finished piece here. So go ahead and bring that one up to your nose. This one has a little bit of a thicker, it's still a thin shell, but it's a little bit thicker than the sea salt caramel. So you should get a little more of that roasted cocoa, espresso, kind of darker chocolate note. What I want you to pay attention with this piece is the center. It's this beautifully creamy, really smooth chocolate ganache that is going to just coat your mouth as soon as you bite into it. Very smooth, dark chocolate. I have some cream notes, vanilla notes, but that's going to melt fairly quickly because we have that beautiful ganache. So ganache is really a fancy word for an emulsion of chocolate and cream. And so we're going to take our cream, heat it up to just below boiling, and we'll pour that over our tempered dark chocolate. And that's going to bring down the temperature of the chocolate. It's going to start to melt a little bit, but it's going to help us form our ganache. And so we'll kind of blend that together, emulsify those ingredients together into this beautiful, shiny, glossy ganache that's going to actually form the center of this piece. We'll add a little bit of vanilla, again, that tenfold vanilla extract that I spoke to, a little bit of salt to accentuate and enhance those flavors, just like in our sea salt caramel. And that's it. You know, when you're using a lot of very premium ingredients, you don't need a whole lot of them to really give yourself an amazing experience. And so it's really noticeable in this piece. So being a dark chocolate, a little richer, a little darker, a little more bitter in flavor, I'm going to jump over to the Stout Edition of the Jamison. Try a little sip of that one.
Yeah, I found the Irish whiskeys just paired so well with this because it's a little without any nuts or anything in there, and the Ganache, that it's just almost like unctuous the way you taste it. The whiskey just kind of just mellows right into it. So I enjoyed all three of the Irish whiskeys, but I think the one you're drinking right now is the one to pair a little bit better with it. But the black barrel from Jamison too really went well with that.
Excellent. All right. Yeah, capture any notes that you'd like on that piece. I would love to hear too, when we get to our last piece here, I'd love to hear about what your favorite piece was. So go ahead and think about that if you will. But if you haven't already, go ahead and pick up your last piece of chocolate here. So this is actually a St. Patrick's Day kind of themed piece. This is one of our signature creme liqueurs, and this is our Irish cream liqueur. Irish cream creme liqueur. So you'll notice here that barrel shape in the mold, but you'll see a little bit more of that colored cocoa butter on this piece. This one's more of a speckle on there to kind of help give you a little bit of contrast to the dark chocolate. Bring this one up to your nose again, get a nice feel for the aroma. Now, when you bite into this one, be careful. The center is a little bit more liquid, so you hear that snap? See that beautiful Irish cream center. So this is an Irish cream. So we actually, one of our signature recipes from Forrest's original, or when he launched the Ethel business back in the early 80s. But the creme liqueur center, we'll start by taking milk, a little bit of butter and sugar, and we're going to blend those in a vacuum kettle. So we pulled a vacuum. It's going to mix and really create this perfect creamy texture in that center. We're going to pour in a little bit of Bailey's Irish cream. We'll add a splash of bourbon. And that's going to form really the center of the piece. We'll add a little bit of salt and again, maybe a little bit of vanilla to that as well. And that's going to form the Irish cream center of this piece. Then we will take it over to our depositing line. And using a process called one shot, we'll actually deposit the center and the shell in one shot right into the mold. And so once that is deposited, the piece will go through into the cooling tunnel, and will take about 20 to 30 minutes to cool completely before it's ready to demold and enjoy. But on this one, tasting it again, you get that Irish cream, a little bit of that caramel kind of flavor coming through as well. The dark chocolate's melting, adding some bitterness. And it's kind of balancing the little bit of spikiness or warmth from the alcohol as well.
Yeah, you can definitely get a little bit of the Irish cream alcohol in there when you just taste it by itself, but just pairing it with the Irish just elevates it to another level. The Jamison Black Barrel, I thought, was just dynamite with this, just kind of elevated the tasting between the dark chocolate and the center and everything. This was just dynamite.
I found that I bit into the center, and then I like the center so much I kind of sucked and had that with the first bite, And then I'm left
I did the
with
same thing. Yeah.
a little bit of the chocolate at the end, which I think is perfect to go and have a little sip of the whiskey. So you have a little bit more chocolate, which is balanced by the whiskey.
Mm.
And it really just brings everything together. It's kind of like two different experiences there.
And you said you put a little bourbon in this as well?
Yes, there is just a little bit
Interesting.
of bourbon. So hope we didn't
Yeah.
offend anybody with the Baileys and the bourbon in there, but
Hey, look, they're all well
Yeah,
done.
it's
So I don't
early.
think anybody's going to get upset about any of that, because I tell you what, we eat and drink better than kings when back in the days when you get to taste chocolate like this and pair it with some whiskeys and like that, and some of the other things people were drinking as well. I was kind of looking across the board. So everybody's drinking pretty good tonight, and they're definitely all getting some good chocolate. So
absolutely. Great. Well, so I'd love to hear from anybody that would like to talk a little bit about maybe their favorite piece, or if you'd like to put something in the chat, any comments or questions. I think we have a few minutes here. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you have. But for those of you that have got to jump, feel free to visit us on ethelm.com to create your own custom box of chocolate. You can use the code VIRTUAL for 15% off. And yeah, so had a really great experience tonight. Hopefully everybody learned a little bit of something, had a wonderful pairing with some whiskey and some chocolate. And more importantly, just really had a great little getaway, little experience with your friends and family, and had a great time.
And we do have a few questions.
Excellent.
One of them is, how do you get the skins off of the bean in large amounts?
Great question. So I kind of skipped, you can get really involved in a lot of the different process steps, but specifically for that, I mentioned when the bean is roasted, they crack a little bit, which kind of helps us start the process. But we'll actually take those beans, and with a lot of air pressure, we'll actually blow the beans typically up like a big tube or up a pipe. And the beans will kind of bounce around inside of that pipe. And as they bounce, it's going to actually break that shell off, kind of just with that air moving through them and bouncing around. And because the shells are very light, those are going to fly away with the air. And then what's going to be left is just that heavier nib. And so the nibs will fall. And so we have a little, a container that captures the nib, whereas the skins will actually kind of fly into a different area of the factory.
And then kind of along that line of that PowerPoint slide, a few people asked about our roasting process, where we do it. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Sure, yeah. So one of the great things about FLM, being that we are a premium chocolate company, we're also a part of Mars Incorporated, which is a larger chocolate company. And what that allows us to do is, actually purchase our own beans. We're one of the few bean to box chocolate manufacturers, in the country. And we're actually buying those beans specific to our requirements or our specifications. We're bringing them into our roasting facility, which is in Pennsylvania. And we're actually roasting those beans just perfectly how we want them for our specific chocolate recipes. So we bring them in, again, depending on the bean or the recipe, we're roasting them a little bit differently. And then that's where we're actually grinding the beans, blending everything down, and we bring it out to our factory in Henderson for kind of the final mixing and blending of the chocolates. And we're actually making our centers in our kitchen. If you ever come to visit us, you can actually see, we have a clear glass window where you can actually see right into the kitchen and see all these pieces that we tried tonight being made right in front of your eyes. So as things get a little safer here in the next year or so, would love to see all of you out at FLM Chocolates to see us making some of these delicious pieces.
Yes, definitely. And then one of the things, I don't know if they can see it because it's a little bit more in the back, but we had some questions about what happens when they're being enrobed with that excess chocolate. And then if you can also touch on optimal heating temperatures to get to that enrobing process. We had a question about that as well.
Sure. So so you couldn't really see in the photo, but that enrobing machine or enrobing line, everything is kind of contained. It's more of a closed system. So the chocolate that gets pumped up into that hopper and comes down over the chocolate, when that falls into the excess that falls away, that's going to go through a screen or a filter and actually get pumped back up and reused for the next few pieces. So we're not wasting any chocolate in that process. I think your next question was around the temperature. So, really we're very concerned about that tempering temperature. So there's a very tight window or temperature range in which we can operate and temper chocolate and enrobe effectively. And so it's a little different depending on dark chocolate, milk chocolate, or white chocolate. But with dark chocolate, it's about 86 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Milk is a little lower, about 84 to 86. And white is actually even lower than that. Can be 82, 83 to 84 or so. It all kind of varies depending on the amount of cocoa butter and the cocoa solids in the recipe. But really important, that temperature and kind of that curve that we follow when we heat and cool the chocolate really forms those really just stable crystals in the color, in the cocoa butter, in the chocolate, that allows it and helps it to set up and have that beautiful gloss and snap when you bite into the piece.
Awesome. And then we can take a few more questions because I want to respect everyone's time tonight. We had another one about how do we select and taste when producing a batch for quality control? So of our pieces, how do we quality control those before getting packed out and put in our retail stores?
Great question. So I guess two things. Specific to the chocolates themselves, the base chocolates, we actually have what we call a conformance panel. And it's a panel of very specially trained tasters that are able to pick up on nuances and different notes in chocolate. And so our chocolate actually goes into that panel and gets tasted daily by those individuals for the specific characteristics that we're looking for. And that's on the chocolate itself. And then obviously we're making our delicious centers in our kitchen and making those finished FLM chocolate pieces. And so when we do that, every finished piece that's made, every production or lot, as we say, has a sample that is pulled from it for tasting by the very same panel of people. So we have a conformance panel for the chocolate recipes, and also, and honestly, all of the raw materials that we use and the finished chocolate pieces as well. So wanting to make sure that the shell thickness is correct and in specification. The center has all those beautiful characteristics, and overall just the flavor is balanced and as expected.
So basically my dream job is what that
Yes.
is. That's awesome. We had some questions about if our factory is open, what other factories are open, and if this will go on our YouTube channel later. So if this is your first time doing a tasting, we post all of our videos on our YouTube, Ethel Chocolates. You can find past tastings as well if you want to learn more about different pieces, but this will be posted on Monday morning. We had a question about the Pennsylvania facility. So our Ethel Chocolates factory, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're the only one that does tours of our factory out of all of the Mars factories and plants. So if you're interested in seeing the behind the scenes of a factory, definitely come out and visit us. We are open. We have reduced hours and limited occupancy, but our cactus garden is open and our factory is open as well. You can find most updated hours on our website. And
yeah, that's correct. I mean, our FLM factories, the factory store is open to the public. A lot of our other factories were making chocolate. As you can imagine, it can be a little dangerous in terms of like equipment running. And so a lot of those factories are not open to the public, but we have some great videos that we share about that process itself. And again, if you come out to see us in Henderson, you can see all of those delicious pieces being made in the FLM factory store. So.
yes, so before we leave, I want to thank Mark and John so much for hanging out tonight, teaching us all about chocolate and whiskey and bourbon. And don't forget the code virtual on the screen will get you 15% off. We have another monthly tasting in April on the 16th. We're doing a floral and chocolate tasting, so it'll be really fun. Some fruity flavors to kind of kick off our spring season. So make sure to use that discount code. It should be on the website by the end of the weekend. And I just realized I said this video will be posted Monday, but it'll probably be posted tomorrow because it is Thursday tomorrow. So you can find it tomorrow. If you want to rewatch anything or learn more, if you didn't catch everything, you can reference it tomorrow.
Excellent. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed themselves tonight. I know I did, tasting these delicious chocolates and some of the spirits, but look forward to seeing you all again in the near future, and have a great night. Happy St. Patrick's Day.